listening to the Philanthropisms podcast with Rodri Davis. Hello and Happy New Year. You're listening to the Philanthropisms podcast. This is the podcast where we try to put philanthropy in context. I'm your host, as ever, Rodri Davis, and we're back after a short break over the festive period with a whole new, series or run of episodes of the show, starting out with a great interview today and carrying on with more great interviews and deep dives over the coming months. So today's conversation is with J. Bob Alotta, who is the Senior Vice President of Global Progammes at Mozilla. Now, Mozilla is a tech company, a really interesting one with a kind of hybrid non-profit commercial structure, which you'll hear us talking about a bit during this episode of the podcast. And previously, Bob was the Executive Director of Astrea, the Lesbian Foundation for Justice, which is a big kind of social justice grant maker based in the US. And so they have a real background in movement building and kind of supporting grassroots organising, which is really interesting in the context of working for an organisation like Mozilla. And I sat down with Bob just before Christmas to have a conversation centred around the intersection of artificial intelligence and philanthropy, which is something that Mozilla is really interested in and funding on, as you'll hear. But also it was very timely because as we recorded this, it wasn't long after all of the hoo-ha about OpenAI and the hiring and refiring of Sam Altman, which is something that we discussed. We had a really fascinating conversation talking about the intersection of philanthropy and AI. We talked a bit about Mozilla's focus on open source and open data and why that was so important to the ethos of the organisation and kind of how they brought that to their thinking about artificial intelligence. We talked a bit about the new $200 million Philanthropic Coalition on AI that Mozilla's joined, which was announced fairly recently and linked to a speech given by Vice President Kamala Harris. We talked about how Mozilla goes about funding its work on AI and particularly the work it does through its fellowship program, where it's sort of supporting individual technologists and scientists, but also sort of activists and artists to develop the technology, but also think about its impact on society. We talked a bit about some of the challenges around data within the non-profit world and kind of how we have to overcome those. We talked a bit about the narratives around AI and how we should understand the risks it poses and whether this sort of relatively simple binary narrative that seems to be emerging between AI boomers who want to see the technology develop more and AI doomers who think that it's all going to destroy humanity and it's a massive existential risk is the right one, or whether it's sort of helpful and actually gets in the way of focusing on some of the more practical, short-term, real-world risks of AI. We talked a bit about whether the recent chaos at OpenAI, whether some of the lessons that seemed to be taken from this by people in the tech world about the fact that you can't really combine profit and purpose in hybrid structures, whether those were unhelpful and actually kind of whether Mozilla's experience of doing that perfectly successfully for many years could be taken as an example of how to do this sort of stuff properly. And we also then talked about what role civil society organisations can play in debates on AI, whether they have enough of a seat at the table at the moment, whether their voice is being heard, what further support they might need in terms of infrastructure and funding to make that voice heard more loudly. And we also talked about whether overall we should be optimistic or pessimistic about the impact of AI on philanthropy and civil society and on society more broadly. So without further ado, let's get into the conversation. I will be back at the end for the usual bit of housekeeping. Okay, great. Well, I'm here with J. Bob Alotta. Hi there, Bob.
Hey there, how are you?
I'm very well, thank you. And thanks very much for joining us on the podcast. It's great to have a chance to talk to you. I'm really excited about it. And for people listening, I'm sure they've heard in the introduction, but you are currently the Senior Vice President for Global Progammes at Mozilla and working with the Mozilla Foundation. And obviously, one of the big areas of interest for Mozilla Foundation and Mozilla as an overall entity is around artificial intelligence, although it's certainly not all of what you want to do. And it would be great to talk to you a bit about that work today. So maybe the best place to start is for you just to say a bit about the work that you do at Mozilla, what your role there is, and what the organization's kind of core interest in AI is.
Yeah, that would be my pleasure. So as the SVP of Global Programs, all of our grant making, our fellowships, our research and analysis via our insights team, special projects like our African Innovation Marathi or the Data Futures Lab, as well as our institutional partnerships and our festival, the Mozilla Festival, all fall under my remit.
Yeah, because I'd seen that there are a few sort of headlines recently. I noticed particularly that it was announced not long ago, I think just about a month ago, that you are one of the funders involved in a new $200 million Philanthropic Coalition that's been launched, that was, I think, sort of linked to a speech that that Vice President Kamala Harris gave about AI as well. And maybe you could say a bit about how that came about and what your involvement in that is.
Sure, I'm happy to. So maybe I'll back up and say my ethos around philanthropy is that we're meant to move money from where it purposefully is to where it purposefully is not, regardless of what you're funding. And so when I think about the resources that philanthropy has, it's really for us to invest that kind of time, talent, to offset the influence of the incumbent tech players around irresponsible companies, those who don't center the people on the planet when developing AI. And so it's exciting for us whenever there's a significant opportunity to collaborate, to have a philanthropic voice, and certainly to aid government in centering people and communities when it comes to the development of technology. So we live really at the intersection of technology and society. And to that end, Mozilla, specifically inside of that $200 million coalition, invests about $20 million annually in philanthropy and advocacy programs related to trustworthy artificial intelligence.
Yeah, absolutely. And in terms of the focus of the work that coalition's doing, that you're doing at Mozilla, you sort of mentioned there about making sure that money gets from where it currently is to where it's not, and that intentionally. When it comes to AI, I mean, one of the things I think that we increasingly hear from voices within civil society is that even where organizations are engaged around AI as an area, or trying to be, it's very difficult to get a seat at the table and to make sure particularly that the voices of kind of marginalized communities are heard in some of these debates that tend to be dominated by the tech industry. What role do you see sort of Mozilla as an organization playing in overcoming that challenge?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. I mean, sort of paramount to our entire theory of change is about working with civil society to both shift the narrative on AI and to build political power as an agency. Really, how are we working with grantee partners to ensure that there's both agency for people as it relates to the technology and accountability as it relates to its deployment and development? We really also believe it matters who's building the technology and have a deep and vested interest in ensuring that people are coming from a diversity of backgrounds, even from an education standpoint, and that we're really looking at both the prototypes and the infrastructure behind the building blocks of AI and investing in things like open data sets. So that's sort of, we really are looking at this through the lens of from the grassroots to the grass tops. How can we aid civil society in ways that are meaningful and have lasting change?
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to ask, actually, because from what I understand, your own background is in movement building, or at least sort of partly in that, and in supporting grassroots organizations and organizations sort of representing marginalized communities. Have you found that experience has been kind of relevant to the role that you're playing at Mozilla as well?
Yes, without question. I mean, I think, first of all, it's kind of this false notion that technology lives in a vacuum. There's no group of people, there's no organized group of people, there's no movement for which technology doesn't also intersect. And so I think it's critically important to focus actually at those intersections, right? How is our work how do we de-silo our work and working at those intersections? So any movement, whether it's labor or the environment or gender justice or economic justice, I think about technology not just as tools, but also as terrain and a place where all of us are living. And so I think philanthropy has in some ways, if we can respect that truth, then it sort of alleviates the need to look very far at who's being impacted and whom we should be partnering with and uplifting.
Absolutely. And one of the things you mentioned, I think already briefly in passing, is the work that Mozilla does through its fellowship program. And I thought that's particularly interesting because it's kind of a model based on funding individuals, or I think small groups of individuals. Can you say a bit about what the sort of theory of change is behind that, and kind of why that is seen as an effective way of trying to drive the agenda forward when it comes to something like AI?
Yeah, I think it's critically important to harbor and cull talent. I think people are really excited when folks make headlines. We can rally around, the shining stars who we understand to be change makers. But usually before folks are in the spotlight, they have a long career that is likely difficult when they're pushing the envelope. And I think Mozilla has a unique role to play there in actually creating a home for folks who are being thoughtful about the implicit biases that could get replicated inside of AI, who are imagining the deployment and development of tools to positively impact society, and who are really looking at how to make data sets transparent and less opaque. So I think out at the crux, at the center of our fellowships and awards program is this idea that if we can bring people together in cohorts, if these singular scholars or singular technologists are actually brought together in community, and we're developing an enduring community of practice, that then will be fueling certainly a pipeline of talent who inevitably will take up the spotlight.
And does within that fellowship, are the people you're funding, and you mentioned they're sort of technologists and scholars, does it also extend beyond that to people who might be working in the arts or kind of trying to use storytelling to explore the impact of AI and other technologies?
Yes, I love that you asked me that question. I have a particularly keen interest. And first of all, I think artists are inherently activists. And we support artists through a number of mechanisms, both through our festival, the Mozilla Festival, and through our Creative Media Awards. And there we really are looking at artistic interrogations of AI so that we can push past the linear narrative and sort of the scripted ways of processing data and information, and actually in many ways envision futures before they're technically tangible. Artists are able to push us into not solely intellectual spaces. And so we try to also, when we're bringing academics, technologists, policymakers, funders together, we also are always bringing artists into the room. And it's my contention that if we can actually have emotional experiences, that'll also influence the way we think about the work that we're trying to endeavor in the present tense. So we have a deep history of supporting artists, and I think it's catalytic to the work that many of us are trying to do.
Yeah, it's really interesting to hear. I've talked to a few people about this, the power of storytelling on the podcast, and I think the point they've made is actually what if you capture an idea in one piece of fiction or art, it can often have an impact that's vastly more than hundreds or thousands of policy reports. So I think it's a really interesting area to fund. One of the things I was hoping to talk to you about, I think, is it feels like a particularly interesting time to be talking about AI as a whole, but also the intersection between AI and philanthropy, because not long before we recorded this, the whole kind of chaos around Sam Altman and his sacking and then rehiring at OpenAI happened. So there was this kind of soap opera that occurred in the world of AI, and lots of people became aware of it as a result of that. And one of the things that I think a lot of commentators have have latched onto is this idea that it was driven by a division within the tech world around whether we should be, optimistic about AI and develop it as fast as possible, or whether we should, have a kind of existential dread about what it might do if we accidentally create superintelligence. I guess my question for you was, do you think that framing is an unhelpful one when it comes to philanthropy and civil society, and that it sort of positions it as if there's only these two options in terms of taking a view, and that doesn't, I think, necessarily represent the reality of where most civil society organizations are at the moment? I mean, what's your thought on that?
Yeah, I appreciate, there's so much to unpack there. So I really
it's a big question, yeah.
You bring that up. Maybe I'll start with, I'll take any opportunity to dispel binary notions of anything. So why don't we start there? Look, I think having such an extreme view of the risks of AI really only serves as a red herring from the actual harms that are taking place, arguably right now. Right. So AI has been deployed for quite some time, right? So generative AI has now taken up kind of the public attention. But even inside of large language models, there are immediate harms where we could well point our attention, and to sort of be taken up by the catastrophic existential threat, I think, redirects resources and attention and scrutiny, quite frankly, that's important to be working with now. So so that's one answer. And then I think there's more to unpack there too, in terms of how are we hopeful, and also where do we think we have power and agency, right? So I think part of that kind of cataclysmic or the existential threat is about how little agency we could imagine we have as it relates to AI. And I would say that again serves a binary or didactic industry, whereas we consent on a daily basis, right? Particularly if we're in a GDPR context, right? But we're constantly being asked for our consent to around the use of our data, and those are real choices. And we could actually spend some time there. And while it might feel boring or nerdy, it's the first line of defense, frankly, into what AI can become. We all have a deep value and trove of agency if we were focusing that level of intention on how to consent to data's use. So while it seems trivial, it's an interesting juxtaposition to this sort of behemoth conversation as it's entered the public sphere.
Yeah, absolutely. And just on that latter point, possibly take us down a slight rabbit hole because it's a big question. But do you think in terms of that question of data and sort of individual data and agency, do you think there's one of the dangers is that we're at a point where the benefits that we're offered through a technology like AI in terms of sort of personalization and having things exactly as we want them, we're almost being asked to make a Faustian pact where we give away our data and some of our freedoms and our agency in return for these things. And perhaps at a societal level, that we need to be clearer that is the deal that we're being asked to make, whereas people, I think, maybe aren't always clear that that's what's going on.
Yeah, I appreciate that framing, and I think it brings us back to this notion of agency. Yes, I think as it is currently written, that seems to be the what's at stake. But I think it's also up to us to ask, need it look like that, right? Should it look like that? Should that be the decision, right? And so I think the questions around, there are a lot of people who are working around how data is the data economy. For example, we have something called the Data Futures Lab at Mozilla, right? It's solely aimed at rectifying the extractive and opaque nature of the data economy, right? Data is the backbone of all systems, right? So we really look at the infrastructure, the technical tools that examine privacy, security, bias, ethics, right? Because we do believe that data could be collected, processed, used, and governed in better ways. So what does it mean to actually empower a public to ask those questions and or have alternatives to offer, right? So are there projects that are rethinking the way that data is collected and used and stored? There are. And so that's also, I think, our responsibility inside a philanthropic frame to invest in those kinds of projects that could have an enduring impact on the way that data is used, on the choices that people actually have, and ask those core questions. Those should be in the forefront and as an option instead of this kind of inevitability of it's either this way or no way, right? In order to have kind of reap the benefit that we have to kind of give up the reward. And I think that that's a false paradigm.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things I know about, have known for a long time, having used Firefox as a product and known about Mozilla, is that the whole concept of doing things in an open source way is kind of core to everything that you do. And you've talked a bit about, trying to sort of take an open approach to data. When it comes to trying to influence the wider development of AI through the work that you do, how big a challenge do you see it as trying to sort of drive the idea that we develop AI, with open source principles in mind, given that there does also seem to be this arms race essentially going on where there are huge commercial prizes to be won as well?
Yeah. I think I guess I would say I'll shy away from any kind of arms race narrative.
Yeah, of course.
Maybe if it were, no, it's not. I think that's how it's being depicted. I think you're reflecting the conversation accurately. So the choice, the poor choice isn't on you. I think that's how we are experiencing this moment. I think that's really accurate, but it in fact, what I think that does is kind of mitigate competition, right? It's suggesting that there's just this inevitable small enclave of giants who are doing this work, right? And so they have the control of the money, the data, and that's the only opportunity, that's the only option. But in fact, there are so many researchers and experts who are building alternatives, and that's why I think in this moment, philanthropy has an outsized role to play to support projects that become less competitive in their nascency in a venture market, right? And so I think we have to, at every chance we get, spotlight and listen to more AI researchers, developers, the tech workers themselves across the globe who are asking the tough questions, who are building responsible or alternatives, right? And so that's to go back to your fellowship question. That's why we work in a fellowship model. Those are the kinds of projects that we support through our myriad grant making. Those are the kinds of stories we uplift even in our own podcast. We have a podcast called IRL, right? And so we highlight so many people who are doing the kinds of work and the kinds of projects that actually are creating alternative, whether it's folks like at Tehiko Media who are they created an indigenous data license that enables communities to maintain guardianship over their data, right? So they're also challenging these kind of binary notions of consent, of the inevitability of how data is valued and deployed, and also isolated from source. There are folks like Dr. Abeba Burhain, who was a fellow of ours, and who's now one of the Times 100 most influential people in AI, right? Who are really looking at the bias that is implicit in large language models. There are many other people who I could uplift, and I think whom we should uplift. And so if their stories are taking up airtime, I think it inherently changes the narrative, changes the inevitability of this didactic existential crisis. It also gives us alternatives and the ability to demand even consumer technology meet the needs of a public and serve a public good.
Yeah, absolutely. And in addition to sort of focusing on how we can support and amplify better ways potentially of developing AI as a technology. Is there also this sort of the other side of it, which is where we might need to look to legislation or regulation to constrain the development of it and maybe kind of put brakes on it at points? And is that something that sort of as a philanthropic funder that Mozilla would also be kind of interested in advocacy that focuses more on that kind of thing as well?
Yeah, I think I love that question, because I think, often regulation or policy feels just as far away as being able to influence as technology does, right? To people like, the lawmakers are just doing X, Y, and Z. But in fact, it's quite a consultative process. And so for us, supporting the researchers, the academics, civil society actors to have a voice in those consultations is critically important and actually makes a world of difference. So I think it's really when we're imagining where we can be influential for a public good, that's actually a critical place. And now is the time. Too often I think policy kind of chases behind the times, and this is one of those moments where we could actually build policy for what we're building in the technosphere. And, we've seen kind of open consultative processes. And I think there are a number of places where these voices can be influential in the United States, in the UK, certainly across Europe, and in also places like Brazil and in India. I think there's a lot of and in East and Southern Africa, we see legislators and policymakers asking questions. And that's why I think we need to support the folks who have opinions that can be helpful to support legislation that actually serves people and not just industry.
Yeah, and obviously you guys are sort of in that space, and you're part of this new coalition of other funders. Do you have a sense that more funders are potentially thinking about this as an area, or do you think that actually the philanthropy world is slightly behind the curve and that we probably need to ramp up efforts quite significantly?
I mean, I think both end.
Yeah.
I think without question, there's a deep desire, and I have certainly seen the shift. A number of years ago, when I was working in queer philanthropy, LGBTQI funders, feminist funders, social justice funders weren't seeing AI or technology as an issue relevant to them. And there were just a few of us who were saying, actually, no, this is a gender justice issue. This is an LGBTQI issue. And certainly those voices are myriad now. So I've seen a huge shift, in philanthropy. And then recently we put out our AI funding principles, in large part because we were getting asked by people who weren't traditionally funding in this space how they could be impactful with their own philanthropy. So we've just put those out. And I suspect in the new year, we'll hold a number of forums and both intimate and public conversations around how funders who are interested in doing this work can do so without abandoning their theory of change, but by leaning into it, without abandoning even their current portfolio structures, but by leaning into it. Oftentimes I talk about technology as terrain for that very reason, because I would be talking to folks in philanthropy who had, for example, their portfolios were only geographic in nature. And I was like, this is where your primary constituency also lives. And so you needn't convince your board that you need an entirely new structure in order to imagine how your primary area of interest or constituency to whom you're accountable and are interested in funding is impacted by technology. In fact, they're living there already. And so I think it's available for everyone to create a digital equity lens through which to fund without abandoning their current philanthropic commitments.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting to hear you use that terminology around lenses there at the end. Certainly when you were talking, it echoed in my mind what I've heard from people trying to work in the climate space and saying we need to get away from the idea that it's about funders needing to be climate funders or environmental funders, and actually it's more about all funders thinking about applying climate as a lens to all of their work. And it feels like there's something very similar to be said about AI as well. In terms of doing that, do you think one of the challenges at the moment for, funders, but also, civil society organizations who might have much more stringent resource constraints is just having, both the time and the space to engage with these issues, but also the resources and the knowledge and the infrastructure to allow them to do that? And if so, what do we need to be putting in place, and what do we need to be funding?
Yeah, that's a critically important question, because the onus can't be on these same groups to just, now figure this piece out, right? It simply doesn't work. I think about it in a few different ways. One is what really for us to take a strong and honest look at what our accompaniment model is. We can't just give money, right? That doesn't work. How are we building relationships with our grantee partners to actually know what they need, and how are we leveraging wraparound support for them to not lose sight of whatever their primary focus is, and also deal with the layered nuance that AI and technology more broadly poses to the work that they're already trying to do, and to create that support. And that we can do that certainly individually, and certainly we as Mozilla have an accompaniment model, but also how are we doing that at a field level? I think the onus is on funders to really look at what a collaborative accompaniment model may look like to enable the long-term sustainability of the movements that we're trying to support. I think that's one. Also, we have one of our fellowship models is actually embedding technologists in civil society organizations, so that they don't actually have to suddenly pivot and or move resource to a whole other layer of expertise. And we really think of them as host organizations that, again, who are working in a cohort model so that they can support each other. The fellows, are also creating a network of practice to support those civil society groups. And I really think about fellows in an organizing model too, that there are plenty of technologists also who are not living siloed lives, who care and are living also at those intersections what the civil society or movement groups might be dealing with, and want to apply that knowledge inside of those movements. And so really supporting not just the individuals, but cohorts of individuals to become integral parts of the movements that we're serving. So that's just two ways of approaching it. But I think it's really important for us to think about also how we can support those groups with unrestricted funds, just as a measure of practice. Are we in right relationship with the groups that we're funding, so that they can actually have the fluidity of funds to meet the moments that they're encountering in ways that are enduring and sustainable and kind of right-sized for whatever comes their way?
Yeah, and it's, just picking up on that, because obviously unrestricted funding and kind of funding core costs and the whole idea of kind of trust-based relationships between funders and grantees are big topics, much more broadly across the philanthropy world at the moment. In terms of your approach, it sounds like certainly when it comes to something like the fellowship, there is a pretty heavy trust-based element to it, and you're kind of willing to fund things where the outcomes might be much longer term and they're relatively uncertain. How does that play out in terms of your kind of approach to measuring the impact, or kind of tracking the impact of what you do? Do you have ways of doing that, or do you just need as a funder to be a little bit more sort of relaxed about not potentially being able to measure those things in quite as rigorous a way as if you were being able to sort of attribute things directly to outcomes?
Yeah, that's such an important question, because if our model of evaluation or learning is rigid, then likely our mechanism for grant making and the outcomes themselves will be rigid. I think it's a multifold answer, right? How are we relying on qualitative experience as well as quantitative? How are we investing in a long game, and how are we measuring that long game in truly iterative successes or failures? I think that that's the other thing, that it's not, if we take a look actually at the way technology companies work, right, or the development of tools, apps, etc., that there's this notion of failing forward, right? That you try something, you break it to make it work. And certainly people and movements and civil society deserve that same luxury, right? To try things, to fail and learn from them. So I think we can't be an impediment to that kind of learning. And so certainly that has to also figure into our own measurement of impact. And then finally, I think knowing what our capacity is and discerning between our own individual institutional capacities and the capacity of the movements to actually be sustainable. And if those are at odds, then it's up to us to actually account for those odds, whether it's account to them, to ourselves, to our teams, to our boards, et cetera. But again, the onus shouldn't be on the grantee partner or the movements at large.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that analogy you draw there between actually the license to fail forward in the commercial side of the tech world, often when people then come to funding nonprofits, they employ much more kind of rigorous and sort of harsher measures. So it's a really interesting point. I don't want to take up too much of your time, so I just have a couple more questions that I'd really love to ask before we finish. One is circling back to the recent situation at OpenAI. We kind of talked about the whole, unhelpfully binary narrative around AI. But I think one of the other things that's come out of that is a lot of people, certainly I've seen commentators within the tech world, seeming to want to draw the conclusion that actually the reason that all happened was that they tried to combine profit and purpose in their structure and try to have this hybrid structure where it was partly non-profit and there was partly a commercial arm. And people sort of saying, oh, well, this just can't possibly work then. But actually, one of the things I've seen people point out is that Mozilla's been happily doing this for a long time. And obviously your structure is a hybrid one. And as I understand, the commercial part of the organization is controlled by a non-profit parent. I just wondered whether you sort of had thoughts on how you can make that kind of thing work well and why it's potentially a powerful model, and whether you feel as though it's something that Mozilla might want to sort of advocate for in future, given that people are starting to look at it slightly more skeptically.
Yeah, you can't see my face because this is a podcast, but I'm smiling. I mean, look, I think that the OpenAI case shows the fault lines, right? And tectonic shifts go in different directions, but that shouldn't say that there can't be solid ground here, right? We've been in the news recently kind of as a juxtaposition to that experience of OpenAI. And, it comes at the same time that we've announced, for example, our stellar new board members who've just come on board. And I think that really does show how we're an example of doing this right. It's about governance and accountability and clarity of purpose. I think the foundation is true to the Mozilla manifesto and the mission, and we have checks and balances and a clear, also distinct, role. We're not here to build product. That isn't what we're doing. We're here as a philanthropy. And so what does that mean? And so that's really about resourcing groups on the ground, taking risks that industry can't take in terms of prototypes that we can fund, and from the positionality of learning and creating artifacts that can be enduring, that we can fund the people asking the hard questions, scrutinizing implicit bias, looking at systemic imbalances and trying to upend them. And so I think the foundation has a very distinct and clear personality inside of the larger Mozilla project, if you will, and a responsibility. And so I think we lean into that responsibility and take it really quite seriously. Those lines aren't blurred for us, and our governance lines aren't blurred, and the relationships and roles are very clear and articulated. So I think, keep looking over here, because we're pretty committed to that model working and working in the service of a public vision.
And it's really great to hear. And then just the final thing I wanted to ask, because I think it's easy when talking about the intersection of philanthropy and AI, and I often find this to end up focusing on the sort of unintended consequences of AI and the need to address those and some of the kind of slightly more pessimistic challenges. But I guess there is a side of it that maybe is more optimistic about how AI might be able to make philanthropy, better and more effective and potentially more democratic and all of these sorts of things. And I just wondered what your thoughts are on what some of the positive potential is for philanthropy, for AI in the world of philanthropy, and whether any of that is stuff that you're trying to put into practice yourselves at the moment in Mozilla in terms of how you go about doing your funding.
Yeah, I certainly, if we had only a pessimistic view, our focus and theory of change would be radically different. Maybe one way that I'll illustrate, or one body of work that I'll uplift here, is our responsible computing challenge, because here I really see, it's very rare. Most of us in philanthropy are trying to right some kind of society's wrongs, right? And I think it's very rare to actually get to have a true pedagogical interruption where there is systemic imbalance. And the responsible computing challenge very specifically looks at creating an intersectional body of work and redefining what computer education is and computer science is. So we're really looking at, while we're certainly involved in the rest of our work at the present tense of what's being built and by whom, we're also looking at taking a generational view and saying, okay, who are the next generation of folks who are going to come up, and how do we ensure that their curricula is truly interdisciplinary, that they represent diversity of builders, come from a diversity of backgrounds, of place, of geographies, of educational experience, etc. And really who are asking the hard questions of what's possible, but also what's responsible. And we've just entered the second phase of our responsible computing challenge. In the US, over 50,000 students have taken over 100 distinct responsible tech courses that have been developed by faculty members across 30 university and colleges. We've expanded RCC globally. So now the program is running in Kenya, in India, we'll beginning our program in South Africa, and we're looking to also expand to Ghana. And then we're building an RCC institute so that becomes a way to kind of train the trainers. And so folks who are interested in building alternative computer science curriculum can do that globally. So I think for us, we're really looking, at all of the layers of intervention. And I feel really excited about the kinds of interdisciplinarity we're seeing inside of the respective institutions, the professors who are taking this up across learning models, whether it's in formal education settings, in labs around the world, in different kinds of training centers. And then with the Institute, it kind of unlocks this work not needing to be housed in an academic institution at all. So that's just one slice of what we do, but I do really, it's something that really excites me and certainly gives me hope that for things to be generated in the future that arguably you and I can't even conceive of.
Yeah, and I mean, that's a great hopeful note on which to leave things as well. So, I mean, just remains to say thanks ever so much, Bob, for finding time to come on the podcast. It's been great to have a chance to talk to you. And I certainly, wish you all the best with the work that you're doing at Mozilla, and we'll be keeping an eye on that in the future.
Thank you so much for having me. It's really been a joy to be here.
Okay, great. Well, my thanks again to Bob for finding the time to come on the podcast. It was really great to have a chance to discuss some of these really kind of big and timely issues. I will put links in the show notes to places where you can find more information about Mozilla and the work that they do, and some things that Bob has said or written about AI and kind of other issues to do with technology and digital civil society. I'll also put links to a couple of relevant other podcast episodes and things that you might want to read that I've written. If you're interested more broadly in issues around philanthropy and civil society, do check out the website at whyphilanthropymatters.com, where you can find lots of articles and news updates, and also all the back episodes of this here podcast. You can also find me on social media. I'm just about still there on Twitter/X, although this might be the year that I finally say goodbye to it. I'm increasingly there on LinkedIn. I might put a bit more effort into Threads this year. I'm also on Blue Sky and Mastodon, although I'm not really putting a lot of effort into those, but please do come and search me out and convince me that I should spend more time on them. Other than that, just like, subscribe, tell all your friends about it. If you know people that you think would be interested in the podcast, please do point them in this direction. If you've got suggestions for topics we could cover or people I could talk to, I'm always in the market for that kind of thing, so please do get in touch. And otherwise, I hope everybody has a great start to the year. Bye!